Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you tonight to talk about family history. So I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. And I know a lot of people do genealogical research, which is about documenting past generations of your family. But I want to talk tonight about telling your family's story, which is more about showing reverence for past generations and honoring their memory. And we'll talk a lot about how we approach doing family history. So I want you to think about, is your goal focusing on building a family tree? And there are people in Ancestry.com, which I use quite a bit, that have 30 or 40,000 people in their family tree, which is a little crazy. Or do you really want to seek to understand the life experiences of those who came before you and understand how their lives actually influence your life today? And that's where I hope we can all get. So I like to say that your family history begins with you because you are doing this work for future generations. And so you want to include in the family history information about yourself. And you begin with what genealogists call a preliminary survey. You gather all the documents that you can find about your life and organize that material. And so it's for easy access when you get to the writing stage. And this is practice for what you're going to do when you start researching your ancestors. Now, journaling is a very important part of getting to that telling your story. Journaling is writing down everything you remember about your family, the stories you heard growing up, and memories arise randomly. So be prepared morning, noon, and night to jot down things that you remember. Maybe you'll be cooking and you'll remember a story of around a certain dish, or you'll be driving somewhere and remember some event that happened, or you'll find old pictures that'll remind you of things. And the trick is to document those when you remember them, because memories are fleeting and you remember it, and then 2 hours later, if you're like me, you're like, I know I remembered something, but now I forgot what I remembered. So I was old school. I put pads all around in my car, by my bed, where I watched TV, so that when I remembered something, I could immediately jot it down and then later transfer it into a document. So once you really feel like you've exhausted your memories, then you want to start interviewing other people, especially the elders in your family, for their memories, and record the conversations. And this, again, will likely turn into an iterative process. I've had conversations with elders in my family, then they would call me back a few years later. Oh, a few days later, a week later, there's something I forgot to mention, and they would tell more stories. So really want to gather everything you can before you begin the actual working with Ancestry.com or a site like that. And you want to do things in an organized way. So you would develop a research plan for each person that you're researching. And you'll identify from your preliminary survey and your interviews, you'll identify what you already know. And then you're going to research what you don't know. And the common challenges at this point would be validating oral information. Did your ancestor remember things correctly, or were they a little off in their dates and their recollection? Common challenges are documenting a female ancestor's maiden name. You may find a grandfather who's married, but you only know the first name of that spouse. So that's another challenge. Or the reverse, you might find someone that seems to be connected to the family, but you don't know what their maiden name or their married name was. So you want to really, that's one of the things that I found really difficult. Death certificates are great for that, by the way. So, death certificates usually will mention the female's maiden name and their parents. Another challenge is where people were born. It's more easily to find where people passed away, especially if they're someone who you knew when they were living and they passed away. You know where they were living. but where were they born? Especially for African Americans, tracing descendants who were enslaved is very difficult. And then identifying an ancestor sibling. So these are all the kinds of things that you'll find yourself digging for and researching. So you want to document your results as you go along, and I'll show you later in some later slides the documentation for the site I use, Ancestry.com, for genealogy information. And if you do plan to publish down the road, you also want to document all other resources. And I followed what's called Associated Press guidelines, so you can look that up and understand what that's about. Some of the places that you'll go for records, well, federal and state census records. A lot of states, especially prior to say 1920 or so, did their own had their own censuses, and they can be very helpful. City directories, local historical societies, obviously libraries. For Connecticut, you can find records going back to colonial times. And just note that you have to have a state library card to access this Connecticut State Library. Ancestry.com is an obvious resource. You can find wills, ship passenger records, immigration records. You may not, and it's a lot more than just names and birth dates, etc. Family search is where people can put family trees. It's sort of a branch of Ancestry.com, but it's also free. So a lot of people use that for family trees. Find a Grave, I have found very useful. Thousands of people across the country have gone to cemeteries and photographed headstones. And it's all online. And I've actually found an ancestor's headstone, not through Find a Grave. Newspapers.com, obituaries, local history. MyHeritage.com is another site like Ancestry. Church publications, funeral programs, church event notices, photos. It's a lot of information. I've found some information on my family in church notices. For African Americans, again, but for all people, a lot of people went to sea, especially in the early 1800s. In New England, whaling was a huge industry. And mostly men who went to sea were given seamen's protection certificates. So then when they were in open water, they could prove they were US citizens. And there's a database at Mystic Seaport. You can check to see if any of the males in your line who lived in the Northeast were seamen on whaling ships. And then don't forget family artifacts. And what I hear often when I've done conversations about my book is inevitably someone who'll come and say, wow, my grandmother died, my aunt died, they had trunks full of pictures, scrapbooks, diaries, etc. And we just threw them all away, not realizing, the significance of those things. So don't overlook ticket stubs. A lot of, again, people traveled by boat or train to get to where they live much of their life, and people often save those as souvenirs. So don't overlook any item that might give you some information. And last but not least, just try Google. You'll never know what you'll find. I actually found some information on my family just Googling them. So take advantage of that. So more on African American family research, you probably want to check out the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. They have some tips on doing Black family research. There's Afrogenius.com, enslaved.org, 1860 slave schedules. Many slaveholders had to report their slaves for tax purposes, and they list them by name. So you may be able to, and these things are all online. And then a tip for the 1870 census. I've heard of many people who are finding their formerly enslaved ancestors by searching for a white person with the same last name as their family, because many African Americans took the name of their slaveholder when they were freed from slavery, and they remained near the plantation. So you may find a slave owner with the last name of your family. Since slaves were property, they're named in wills, inventories, tax lists, as I mentioned, and deeds, and these may be available in a state's archives. If your ancestors were enslaved and were freed because of the Emancipation Act, then they would have access to the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, and those records are available online as well. And then there's a collection of slave narratives in the Library of Congress. It's not everyone who was enslaved, but there were many people who were interviewed in the 1930s who had been born and enslaved, and their stories are available. They're called the slave narratives. And again, they're in the Library of Congress. So there's a lot of places to go for research. It can be overwhelming, but just take your time and plow through it. And as I said in the previous slide, look for, document your specific questions that you're researching for. That's how genealogists think, rather than just kind of going on Ancestry and exploring, because you can burn a lot of time and not get anywhere. So we're going to have people put in the chat, and we'll talk about these questions later. Are there any family history resources that you found that I didn't mention? We'd love to know. We'd all love to know. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about family trees and DNA, but this is not a tutorial on Ancestry.com. There are tutorials available in Ancestry or MyHeritage or Family Search, whatever family tree tool you choose. But what I want to share is some tips and things that I learned that have been helpful to me. Now, just some basics of DNA, and I do recommend you getting DNA analysis. The test that you get when you go through Ancestry or MyHeritage is called the autosomal test, and it gives you your ethnicity results. If you're, for example, trying to identify if you have a white male who was an ancestor because of an enslaved, may have fathered a child during slavery, then the Y DNA test is available, and there are sites for that. And if someone wants to trace their female line, perhaps they were adopted and want to find their real mother, they would use the mitochondria DNA test. But for the most part, most of us are just getting the test for our ethnicity and estimates. So I want to talk about how family trees and DNA work together. And the reason I want to show you why using the same site for both can be very helpful. So there was a mystery, a family mystery in the Snyder side of my family, my father's side of the family. It was passed down that two people disappeared in the 1800s and were never heard from again. And I wasn't really out to solve this mystery, but I was able to. So the first tip I want to give you on using Ancestry or similar tools, when you search census records, always look 10 pages before and 10 pages after your ancestors, especially the early years, the 1870s, the early 1900s, because families that lived near each other often intermarried. People weren't as mobile as we are today. So this is from the 1860 census, and I'm sure it's hard to read, but you see where the arrow is for Simon Snyder, who was my great-great-grand, I've got them backwards. Well, I see great-great-grandmother, I'm sorry, you see Julian. And somehow the great-great-grandfather line is missing. All right, let me back up. You see 1860 census, paternal great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother. So there's Simon and Julian Snyder. And then down below, you see another Simon who is my great-great-grandfather. And so there, what's interesting about this is that there's a woman, a child in the family named Catherine Enty. So there's a child that they're raising who is not their own child, or who was living with them at the moment the census is taken that's not their child. All right, so I looked for the Enty family to see if I found anyone else with Entys, and not far away, doing that scan, 10 pages before, 10 pages after, I found an Enty family, and there was a Rebecca Snyder living with the Enty family. And I don't know if she was the spouse of, down below, you see a William Enty, and there's two children, uh, 3 years old and 1 years old, if they're actually living together or, and I haven't been able to discern it, but the thing is, it shows that the Snyder family and the Enty family were very close. They were, very close indeed. And I made a note of that. And sometime later, it popped up in my ancestry, a person named Christy Russo. And lo and behold, she had my great great grandfather and great great grandmother in her family tree. So by her having her family tree in ancestry and me having mine in ancestry, ancestry actually pushes this notice out to us that we had these common ancestors. So that's one of the values of having the DNA and the tree together. And you see on the right, you see the arrow pointing on the right to Margaret Ann Enty. So I could click on Margaret Ann, and boom, I found that Margaret Ann Enty's mother was Esther Jane Snyder, and she was married to a man named Edward Simeon Enty. And because I had the name Christy Russo, who had entered, this is her information that she entered. I was able to contact her, and she responded very quickly. So if someone contacts you because they found information, please respond to anyone who reaches out to you. So her message back to me was that her second great grandmother was born in Canada. And in the 1871 census, she's living with her parents, Esther Jane Snyder and Edward Enty. And she goes on to say that, toward the end, that, as you know, this was that she found out that she was born in Canada. Esther Jane Snyder's, her census information indicates she was born in Canada, but Esther Jane's information was that she was born in Pennsylvania. And she says, as you know, this was the time when many free African Americans and slaves fled to Canada from northern states because of the Missouri Compromise. And so the mystery was solved, I believe. I don't have exact details, but I believe this must be the two people that disappeared and were never heard from again. And I found, when I checked Ancestry again for shared matches that I have with Christy Russo, a whole list of people came up, most of them living in Canada. So these are cousins of mine who've descend from Esther and Edward. Esther, yeah. So anyway, so another tip is I color code the different lines, so it's very easy to sort, like I've sorted here. And the different colors match up with different family lines. So I color coded all the people related through my Canadian family. So have you solved any family mysteries, or is there a mystery that you would hope to solve when you're doing your research? So now I'm going to go on to talking about, I think what people are hopefully most interested in is how do you like take all this data, you've got ancestry and all this information, and turn it into a narrative. And I like this quote from James Baldwin: people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. Now, some people attribute this to Maya Angelou, but I believe it was actually James Baldwin who said it first. And so what we want to do is expand our view of just, the narrow facts about where our family was born, where they married, when they died, and look at, include context and understand the context of their lives. When and where does their story begin? What were the conditions in the place at the time? What was happening in the US with their wars going on? What about the places where your ancestors emigrated from, if they came from Europe or Asia? Was there famine, political upheaval? What's the local history, geography, and economy? And how did that shape your family's life? Who were their neighbors, as I just showed you? Neighbors are important. there are a lot of intermarriages, and were they living in a place where there was an ethnic mix, or were there other families from the same places that your ancestors came from? We know that communities tend to come to America and stick together, so we want to understand all of that. So a few of the I'm just going to talk about a few of the contextual things that I added in my story about my family as examples. So the question is, when and where does the story begin, and what historical events had an impact on your family? For me, an impact was the Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. It was the first act in the United States that allowed any enslaved person born in Pennsylvania to be free after 28 years. And because of this, Pennsylvania was regarded a land of freedom, and it was a destination of many people who escaped slavery to get to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a border with Virginia. And so a lot of, and that's where my ancestor, I was able to find in my research that my ancestor was born on a Virginia plantation. I haven't been able to figure out which one, although I've honed in on one I think is might be it. He escaped from a Virginia plantation in the 1820s and then lived his life out in Pennsylvania as a free man. So that was a historical event that adds context to my story. So what's the geography where places where you lived? And the geography helps to build, for me at least in my story, helped to build an emotional connection. Because much of the early history of my family took place in a tiny village of Catawissa County, Pennsylvania, in Columbia County, Pennsylvania. And that's my ancestor, Henry. When he escaped from the Virginia plantation, he actually followed the Susquehanna River all the way north up into New York to, I think, Elmira. And then he ended up coming back south again. He got married there and came back south again and settled for decades in this little village of Catawissa, which I've had a chance to visit. And it's a beautiful little place. It's nestled between a mountain ridge and the Susquehanna River. It was first settled by Quakers in the 1700s, and the Quakers built a log meeting house on a knoll a short distance from the meeting place of the Catawissa Creek, which feeds the Susquehanna River. And in the rear of the structure, there's a hillside burial ground surrounded by a stone wall, and 3 generations of my family are buried there. So having a sense of Catawissa was important to my story, and in that place, because 3 generations lived there, is referred to again and again. And adding context also helps to explain anomalies. When you're researching the family, you'll find information that it doesn't seem to make sense. For me, it was my ancestor Henry, who had escaped from slavery. He shows up in the 1850, 1860, and 1870 census, but in each of those, his birthplace is documented as a different place. So 1850, it says he was from New York, and that kind of makes sense because he had lived in New York for a while and come to Pennsylvania. Then the 1860 census said he was from Pennsylvania. And then 1870 finally has his true birthplace, which is Virginia. And I really wrestled with, why is that? But I found a great book on the Black history of, or African Americans in Pennsylvania, its actual title. And in that book, it had this comment about Columbia County, which is where Catawissa is. And it said, many citizens sympathized with Southern slave owners. Paid slave catchers searched the county for fugitive slaves and to also kidnap free Blacks who had been residents of the county for years. So that, to me, I intuited from that that's why his true birthplace couldn't be disclosed before the Civil War, because he was escaped from slavery, and certainly people would have captured him to send him back south again. And so that is another reason to try to get an understanding of the context of your parents' lives, to explain things that might be confusing. Now, the last piece of context I'll talk about is for World War II in the draft. In my book, Dear Mary, Dear Luther, has my parents' love letters from the late 1930s, early into 1940. And they have a series of letters discussing the draft. And so I added some context about that. And so we all know that in 1940, there was an invasion of German forces into the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. But what I didn't realize was the drama of the draft. So on September 16th, 1940, Congress passed the Burke-Wadsworth Act, also known as the Selective Service Act, and the draft was born. All men between the ages of 21 and 36 were required to register. So my father was 29, so he had to register. The first draftees were selected on October 29th. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson drew draft numbers out of a glass bowl and handed them to President Roosevelt. The president read them aloud to the nation. So you can just imagine the drama in households all over America, people listening to this on the radio and wondering, worrying about their young men being drafted and how likely they might be drafted. And so everyone, I would think everyone alive today would have an ancestor that lived during this period and maybe was definitely eligible for the draft, maybe ended up not serving, but would have lived through this drama of, for the first time, the country drafting people to go to war. And again, this adds a lot of emotional context. You might find your ancestors' registration card in ancestry.com. It's available there, but there's a whole lot around that future generations would need to know to understand the emotions and feelings of people at that time. So sources for context, libraries, obviously, historical societies where your ancestors lived. I found those to be very helpful. For national, international history, of course, there are a lot of books available. You can, again, visit a library. I found some useful websites, newspapers.com, New York Times Archives, Years in History, historical events by year on this day. Those are all links. And again, just use Google and you'll get more than information that you probably want. So getting around to, you've gathered information, you've got a lot of context, you've got notebooks and folders full of information. How do you actually start crafting a narrative? Well, my approach was to write from my maternal line separately, just to make it easier and cleaner. And then I even wrote by my grandparents' line separately, so that it was, it's, I think, makes it easier to follow. Sometimes people try to keep everything together chronologically across all their ancestors, and I just find that to get very confusing. So you want to avoid disclosure of personal data or confidential secrets that might be hurtful to living persons or even potentially create illegal issues. So you're not writing an expose, and you just want to be thoughtful of people's feelings as you're writing. But share what you've intuited. If, like I gave the example of figuring out why my ancestors' birthplace changed from census to census. It's okay to draw conclusions from the information that you have and state your, well thought out opinion of how to interpret things. Definitely add images. And again, like I said in the beginning, in gathering information about yourself, you want to include yourself in the story, because you want to think of yourself as this, you're writing this for future generations. So write a little about your life, your observations, and really add how writing the history impacted you, because it's that deeper thinking that will draw people to your work. Now, some ideas for ways to share. You can just create a PowerPoint like I'm doing here, or a document, and email it to family members. You can share your manuscript and photos and videos in something like Dropbox or Google Docs. Which, what I've done is start a secret family Facebook group and invited family. And as I was gathering information and learning more about my story, I was sharing my information with my broader family network, distance cousins that I've found through doing the research, and cousins that I've known all my life. So it's really, really brought together all the generations. We just had a meeting recently, about maybe 2 months ago, where we all got on, and I shared some updates on the family history, and everybody had a chance to talk about what was going on in their lives. It was really awesome. If you've got the tech talent and know-how, you can create a website. I just talked about hosting a meeting. And then the ultimate, which is publish a book, which is the route that I took. I had about, I don't know, I think 150, 160 letters that my parents had written to each other. And so the idea of was hatched from having those letters to actually put them in a book. And but it's definitely, many people have published books about their families. So how do you publish a book? Well, you've got to write your narrative. And my approach was, I wrote it, I set it aside for a while, went back and let it sit for a while, rewrite to polish the words, because that's how I am. If you have the means, engage a professional book editor to give you feedback. And I found that very helpful. And it wasn't terribly expensive. It was in the hundreds of dollars, but it was an outlay. And when you think you're done with the narrative, carefully add all of your citations and sources, and proofread, which was the most gruesome part of it all, proofreading. And then you want to have what is called a beta reader. Have someone who's already published review your book and advise if an agent would accept your book and market it for you to publishers, or whether or not you should go ahead and self-publish. So I got the feedback that I should self-publish, because I wanted to include all the letters my parents had written to each other. And my beta reader said a publisher probably would not want to print all of them. So I moved forward with self-publishing. And then after your book is published, and that's probably about a 6-month process, but you email off your manuscript, and there are a lot of little decisions that you have to make along the way, where to put pictures, for example. And do you want to do like footnotes in like academic style footnotes, or do you want to put all your sources at the end? That's a little, decisions you have to make in order to go forward to publish. And then when you've done, celebrate and enter book contests. And I did it. It was fun. Never really expecting to win an award, but boom, I just like can't believe that I actually did win an award for my book. It was such an exciting moment, and you may too. So why not go for it? So I have set up a Connecticut Family Researchers Facebook group, and I'm going to put this presentation out there. Only a few people have joined, but I was hoping it would be a forum for people who are researching to continue the conversation, ask each other questions, or a place you could ask me questions, and hoping it can grow into a resource that you find useful. So that concludes what I had prepared to say. So now I know we had some chat questions. I see there's some there's 6 in the chat, and we can ask questions and take the conversation wherever you'll find it helpful. So who's going to moderate the chat? Is that Jasmine?
Hi, Jill. Yes. Thank you so much for this presentation. We really, really appreciate this. And I just want to make a note and also give you a second to take a breather, and note that, we do, if you do have ancestors or folks that in your family that grew up in Hartford, we are hosting this through the Hartford History Center, and we do recommend that would love to see you come by to the Hartford Public Library and come talk to us about some of the materials that we do have that may be connected with your ancestors. So I just want to put that plug out there. We do have some really cool vital records from the city. We have yearbooks, which are also really, super fun. And we've had a lot of folks find their ancestors in yearbooks, and a number of other materials. And so I just want to put that plug in real quick. And then, yeah, we can get into some questions, Jill. We've had a few questions come in from Teresa, and two of these are kind of related. She asked about how do you keep your documents secure from identity theft? So birth certificate, marriage, etc. And related to that, does everyone on Ancestry have access to your pictures and information if that's where you upload?
So for well, the information like death certificates and birth certificates are public information. So you don't put anything out there for a living person, that's for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be my best advice. But anybody can go onto Ancestry or any other site and find the birth and death information. So there's no way to protect it. And what was the second question?
Yeah, and if I guess similarly, and I think you kind of answered it, but does everyone have access to your information if it's on Ancestry?
Yeah, so to be clear, it's on Ancestry. Whether you
Right.
found it or not doesn't control whether it's out there.
Yep.
It's just there. So yeah, I would just caution you not to put any information for a living person.
Great. This question from Colleen that I think is a good one is, can you speak to how can you motivate family members to share their memories? Sometimes, and I know I've gotten this from even like my parents, is like they'll like tell you a tiny tidbit, and sometimes stories can be hard. And sometimes, yeah. Right? So what has been your experience in doing some of that interviewing process and getting family members to share more?
I think it helps. For me, it was already knowing some things, like having done some research and saying, oh, Uncle Harry, I found your, certificate from going into World War II, your draft registration, and got him to talk about the war. My Uncle Clarence, Mom told me a lot about growing up in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, what it was like, and what do you remember? And so, already having done a little bit of research and understanding, and don't ask. So I would say for your parents, if they're reluctant, maybe not so much asking them directly about things they've done, but asking them, do you remember your grandmother or your grandfather, and what do you remember about them? Like ask them about their memories rather than trying to get them to disclose information about themselves. And maybe, after a while they'll open up to share more. And some things are painful. And I'll share that my father never knew his father. And so that was a really painful topic. I never ever asked him about that. And accepted that I would never know, some things that I was curious about.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a couple more questions. So there's a question here about if a family member came to this country with one name and then stayed using another name, how do you navigate the changing of names and information and trying to find people even if their names are to have changed?
Yeah, that's a common problem. Gather everything you can about the person, if you know when they arrived, how they arrived, who they may have traveled with. It probably is a good clue. So you might find, someone came from, name a country, I don't know, Greece. And there, what happened a lot was the people that at immigration anglicized names. But you might know that, well, he came over with his friend at the same time, or a brother or someone. And you may find that being able to link people together on the same ship, if you know about when they arrived, you can check immigration records. I mean, that's, I took a course at Boston University's genealogy course, and that was the method that they recommended for finding people whose names were altered, is try to gather everything else you can about that person. What town did they come from in the country they came from? When were they born? Because a lot of that, when you go to the passenger records for ships, there's a lot of information in those old passenger records. And so you may be able to match that way.
Right.
Did I get to that? Did I get to the question right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And there's a question just here, kind of also like kind of logistics, like, are most records in Connecticut free, such as birth and death records? I know from my experience that is the case if they're available, but sometimes there's like subscriptions to some of these sites. But I don't know, Jill, what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, I mean, Ancestry, there's a subscription. You might be able to get things from your town, but they even might charge a fee as well. If you know the town where someone was born or where they died, you'd have birth and death certificates, but a lot of those are being made available only through Ancestry. So I'm afraid there's likely to be a cost.
Yeah.
Now the trick about Ancestry is you don't have to do a year subscription. So what those of us who use it a lot, store up all the questions you have, take out a 1-month subscription, do all your research, and then cancel it. So when I go in, I pay for a month, and then the next day I go in and cancel it. So you have it for that month, and you won't forget to cancel it at the end of the month because it's already canceled. And I know a lot of people who do it that way.
Right. And you can download those materials, and then
you can download those materials, and you have access to your stuff even when you cancel your subscription. They don't take your stuff away.
Excellent.
But you can't add new stuff, but they don't you still have access to everything you've put out there, family trees you've created, documents that are out there. You can't, do you could do some limited searches so that they don't even block you out completely from that. But that's the way we all save money on Ancestry. And I would assume the other site, I know myheritage.com, you probably can do the same thing. Myheritage.com is a similar site. Now, the family tree, which is an offshoot of Ancestry, is a free site for family trees, but they're public trees. So anybody can add on to your tree, change your tree. But it might be useful for you finding information on your ancestors by searching family tree. Personally, I haven't found it useful, but I know that there are people who have found it very useful.
Excellent. I like this question because it's more about the storytelling aspect of your work. And so there's this question about different family members telling the story differently, and how do you kind of reconcile what is the truth, or like the multiple truths that exist within a story? Do you tell kind of the nuances of that?
Yeah, that's tough. Well, documentary evidence will help you. Lining up, the story with ages and other things that happen in the family. Someone said it's happened 20 years ago, and you're like, and someone else says it happens 30 years ago. Well, how old were they when this happened? And does it make sense? looking for other contemporary events. Oh, what was happening at the same time that your story was happening, right? And does it line up with the general history and the context that I talked about earlier? Does it fit? Does the story, which version of the story fits with the context? Because people do get confused about things and have different memories. That's true. And there are things that I remembered growing up, things that I did. I mentioned something that I did with my cousins, and my cousins like, we don't remember that. But it was kind of an innocent, thing that I was talking about. So I left it in the book, even though they said they didn't remember.
Right. There's so for those that are interested in these slides in the future, we are recording this presentation, and it is going to be available through the Ancient Burying Ground Association's YouTube page. So it is something that you could refer to in the future if you want to go back and re-listen and look at some of the slides. It'll be available that way. Just wanted to make that note. There's also a question here about one of a founder in Hartford, and finding information about founders, which I think in the presentation from last, oh, hold on. I don't know what happened there. Okay. I think what happened in the last presentation, last week's presentation, there was a lot more about colonial ancestors and finding information. So I don't know if Ty or Mary could kind of speak to some of that information, because I know he's also mentioning that his name is in the center of the ancient burying ground behind Hooker, in the ancient burying ground. So I know that information is a lot more readily accessible, and maybe Ty or Mary could speak to that. I think we might have lost Jill. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. What else? What other questions here? Yeah. Ty or Mary, if you want to kind of speak to that question.
Okay, so this is Mary. We did have a lot of the colonial 17th and 18th century research last week. You could definitely email the Ancient Burying Ground. The email's on our website, and we do have people that are knowledgeable about families that are buried in the cemetery. There's also an organization called the Founders. I think it's called the Founders of the City of Hartford, or Founders of Hartford, and they have all done genealogical work to demonstrate that they're descendants from those families. So I would say start with an email to the Ancient Burying Ground and to the Founders of Hartford Society.
Send us an email. You can find it on our webpage.
Yep.
Excellent. And I think Jill is back. Okay. Were there any other questions that I missed that are really kind of itching to ask? Because we're making really good time tonight. And again, just want to thank everybody for coming out this evening and spending this time with us. I think Jill did an excellent job with her presentation.
I could add a quick note. In my family, we found in the family Bible birth notices, death notices, newspaper clippings from well over a century ago. So check the family Bible. That's where a lot of family items are stored. And another free resource for genealogical research is familysearch.org. I believe that's sponsored by the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints Church. But that's a remarkable resource, and it's free.
Thank you, Ty.
So I just want to, before we go, just to say again that I believe that we should be mission driven in our family history. It's so important to pass this information on to future generations. And look how blessed the gentleman who spoke is to have the family Bible with everything recorded. I wish I had that, which I didn't have that resource, and many of us don't. But to really be mission driven. There was an African-American poet named Arna Bontemps, and he asked the question, is there something we have lost, something precious we have forgotten in our wandering, something to that effect? And I think the something precious we've lost is people in this country that have been so mobile and come from so many places, is the connection to our ancestors. So I just want to encourage everyone to go forth and don't feel like it has to be all done in a short amount of time. This really turns into like a lifetime preoccupation for many of us. You know, the more we learn, the more we want to learn. So I wish you all the best of luck in your research projects.
Thank you so much, Joe.
You're very welcome. So happy to be with you.
Thank you, Jill. Jasmine, thank you very much for hosting this tonight. This is a great partnership between Hartford Public Library and the Ancient Burying Ground Association. I love it. And Mary Donahue, thank you for coordinating this for us.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much again for being with us. And if you haven't signed up and you're interested, we have our final program of the series next Wednesday, again at 6 o'clock. And that is with Richard Ross, is it the second or third?
Third.
The third.
Third.
On Hartford's witch hunt.
The Great Witch Hunt in Hartford.
Yeah, so that should be really fascinating as well. And thank you all again, and I hope you guys have a beautiful evening.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.